The Paris Peace Accords of January 27, 1973 intended to establish peace in Vietnam and an end to the Vietnam War. It ended direct U.S. military combat, and temporarily stopped the fighting between North and South Vietnam. The governments of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States, as well as the Provisional Revolutionary Government that represented indigenous South Vietnamese revolutionaries, signed the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam on January 27, 1973. The agreement was not ratified by the United States Senate. The negotiations that led to the accord began in 1968 after various lengthy delays. As a result of the accord, the International Control Commission was replaced by International Commission of Control and Supervision to fulfill the agreement. The main negotiators of the agreement were United States National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Vietnamese Politburo member Th. Tho. The two men were awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts, although Th. Tho. refused to accept it. Provisions of the Accords. The document began with the statement that the United States and all other countries respect the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam. The inclusion of this provision was a victory for the Communist side of the negotiations by allowing that the war was not a foreign aggression against South Vietnam. The main military and political provisions of the agreement were, beginning on the 27th of January 1973 at midnight Greenwich Mean Time, in Saigon time 8 o'clock on the 28th of January, there would be an in-place ceasefire. North and South Vietnamese forces were to hold their locations. They were permitted to resupply military materials to the extent necessary to replace items consumed in the course of the truce. Once the ceasefire is in effect, U.S. troops would begin to withdraw, with withdrawal to be complete within 60 days. Simultaneously, U.S. prisoners of war would be released and allowed to return home. The parties to the agreement agreed to assist in repatriating the remains of the dead. There would be negotiations between the two South Vietnamese parties, Saigon and the Viet Cong, towards a political settlement that would allow the South Vietnamese people to decide themselves the political future of South Vietnam through genuinely free and democratic general elections under international supervision. Reunification of Vietnam was to be carried out step by step through peaceful means. Paris peace negotiations. Early deadlocks. Following the success of anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy in the New Hampshire primary in March 1968, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson halted bombing operations over the northern portion of the North Vietnam, in order to encourage Hanoi to begin negotiations. Shortly thereafter, Hanoi agreed to discuss a complete halt of the bombing, and a date was set for representatives of both parties to meet in Paris. The sides first met on the 10th of May, with the delegations headed by Shan Thuy, who would remain the official leader of the North Vietnamese delegation throughout the process, and U.S. Ambassador-at-Large W. Averell Harriman. For 5 months the negotiations stalled as North Vietnam demanded that all bombing of North Vietnam be stopped, while the U.S. side demanded that North Vietnam agree to a reciprocal de-escalation in South Vietnam. It was not until the 31st of October that Johnson agreed to end the airstrikes and serious negotiations could begin. One of the largest hurdles to effective negotiation was the fact that North Vietnam and its ally in South Vietnam, the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, refused refused to recognize the government of South Vietnam with equal persistence. The government in Saigon refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the NLF. Harriman resolved this dispute by developing a system by which North Vietnam and U.S. would be the named parties. NLF officials could join the North Vietnam team without being recognized by South Vietnam, while Saigon's representatives joined the U.S. allies. A similar debate concerned the shape of the table to be used at the conference. The North favored a circular table, in which all parties, including NLF representatives, would appear to be equal in importance. The South Vietnamese argued that only a rectangular table was acceptable, for only a rectangle could show two distinct sides to the conflict. Eventually a compromise was reached, in which representatives of the Northern and Southern governments would sit at a circular table, with members representing all other parties sitting at individual square tables around them. Claimed sabotage of negotiations by Nixon campaign. Bryce Harlow, former Eisenhower White House staff member, claimed to have a double agent working in the White House. I kept Nixon informed. Harlow and Henry Kissinger separately predicted Johnson's bombing haul. Democratic Senator George Smathers informed Johnson, "The word is out that we are making an effort to throw the election to Humphrey. Nixon has been told of it." According to presidential historian Robert Dallek, Kissinger's advice rested not on special knowledge of decision-making at the White House but on an astute analyst's insight into what was happening. William Bundy stated that Kissinger obtained no useful inside information from his trip to Paris, and almost any experienced Hanoi watcher might have come to the same conclusion. While Kissinger may have hinted that his advice was based on contacts with the Paris delegation, this sort of self-promotion is at worst a minor and not uncommon practice, quite different from getting and reporting real secrets. Nixon asked Tanner Cheno to be his channel to Mr. Tew. Cheno agreed and periodically reported to John Mitchell that Tew had no intention of attending a peace conference. On November 2, Cheno informed the South Vietnamese ambassador, "I have just heard from my boss in Albuquerque who says his boss is going to win, and you tell your boss to hold on a while longer." In response, Johnson ordered the wiretapping of members of the Nixon campaign. Dallek wrote that Nixon's efforts probably made no difference because Tew was unwilling to attend the talks and there was little chance of an agreement being reached before the election. However, his use of information provided by Harlow and Kissinger was morally questionable, and Humphrey's decision not to make Nixon's actions public was an uncommon act of political decency. Nixon government. In 1969, Richard Nixon succeeded to the U.S. presidency and replaced Harriman with Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who was later replaced by David Bruce. Also that year, the NLF set up a Provisional Revolutionary Government to gain government status at the talks. However, the primary negotiations that led to the agreement did not occur at the peace conference at all but were carried out during secret negotiations between Kissinger and Ladakh, though, which began on the 4th of August 1969. North Vietnam insisted for 3 years that the agreement could not be concluded unless the United States agreed to remove South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu from power and replace him with someone more acceptable to Hanoi. Nixon and Kissinger were unwilling to overthrow through an agreement a government the NLF had failed to overthrow by force of arms. Though the extent of North Vietnamese demands is contested, Marilyn Young contends that the contents of Hanoi's proposal were systematically distorted from their original plea to permit Thieu's replacement, to what Kissinger propagated as a demand for his overthrow. breakthrough and agreement. On the 8th of May 1972, President Nixon made a major concession to North Vietnam by announcing that the U.S. would accept a ceasefire in place as a precondition for its military withdrawal. In other words, the U.S. would withdraw its forces from South Vietnam without North Vietnam doing the same. The concession broke a deadlock and resulted in progress in the talks over the next few months. The final major breakthrough came on the 8th of October 1972. North Vietnam had been disappointed by the results of its Nguyen Hue offensive, and feared increased isolation if Nixon's efforts at détente significantly improved U.S. relations with the chief communist powers, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, who were backing the North Vietnamese military effort. In a meeting with Kissinger, though significantly modified his bargaining line, allowing that the Saigon government could remain in power and that negotiations between the two South Vietnamese parties could develop a final settlement. Within 10 days the secret talks drew up a final draft. Kissinger held a press conference in Washington during which he announced that peace is at hand. Quote, When Hue, who had not even been informed of the secret negotiations, was presented with the draft of the new agreement, he was furious with Kissinger and Nixon and refused to accept it without significant changes. He then made several public radio addresses, claiming that the proposed agreement was worse than it actually was. Hanoi was flabbergasted, believing that it had been duped into a propaganda ploy by Kissinger. On the 26th of October, Radio Hanoi broadcast key details of the draft agreement. However, as U.S. casualties mounted throughout the conflict, American domestic support for the war had deteriorated, and by 1972 there was major pressure on the Nixon administration to withdraw. Consequently, the U.S. brought great diplomatic pressure upon the South Vietnamese ally to sign the peace treaty even if the concessions Thieu wanted could not be achieved. Nixon pledged continued substantial aid to South Vietnam, and given his recent landslide victory in the presidential election, it seemed possible that he would be able to follow through on the pledge. To demonstrate his seriousness to Thieu, Nixon ordered the heavy Operation Linebacker 2 bombings of North Vietnam in December 1972. Nixon also attempted to bolster South Vietnam's military forces by ordering that large quantities of U.S. military material and equipment be given to South Vietnam from May to December 1972 under Operations Enhance and Enhance Plus. These operations were also designed to keep North Vietnam at the negotiating table and to prevent it from abandoning negotiations and seeking total victory. Operation Linebacker 2 lasted from the 18th of December to the 29th of December, when the North Vietnamese government agreed to resume technical discussions with the United States. President Nixon ordered a halt to bombings north of the 20th parallel on the 30th of December. With the U.S. committed to disengagement, Thieu had little choice but to accede. On the 15th of January 1973, Nixon announced a suspension of offensive actions against North Vietnam. Kissinger and Tho met again on the 23rd of January and signed off on a treaty that was basically identical to the draft of 3 months earlier. The agreement was signed by the leaders of the official delegations on the 27th of January at the Hotel Majestic in Paris. Aftermath. The Paris Peace Accords effectively removed the U.S. from the conflict. However, the agreement's provisions were routinely flouted by both the North Vietnamese and the Saigon government, eliciting no response from the United States, ultimately resulting in the Communists enlarging the area under their control by the end of 1973. North Vietnamese military forces gradually built up the military infrastructure in the areas they controlled, and 2 years later were in position to launch the successful offensive that ended South Vietnam's status as an independent country. Nixon had secretly promised Thieu that he would use air power to support the Saigon government should it be necessary. During his confirmation hearings in June 1973, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was sharply criticized by some senators after he stated that he would recommend resumption of U.S. bombing in North Vietnam if North Vietnam launched a major offensive against South Vietnam. But by August 15, 1973, 95% of American troops and their allies had left Vietnam, both North and South, as well as Cambodia and Laos. However, Nixon was driven from office due to the Watergate scandal in 1974, and when the North Vietnamese began the final offensive early in 1975, the United States Congress refused to appropriate additional military assistance for South Vietnam, citing strong opposition to American involvement in the war by Americans and the loss of American equipment to the North by retreating Southern forces. Thieu subsequently resigned, accusing the U.S. of betrayal in a TV and radio address. At the time of the peace agreement, the United States agreed to replace equipment on a one-by-one basis. But the United States did not keep its word. Is an American's word reliable these days? The United States did not keep its promise to help us fight for freedom, and it was in the same fight that the United States lost 50,000 of its young men. Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese army supported by Viet Cong units on April 30, 1975. Schlesinger had announced early in the morning of the 29th of April the beginning of Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation from Saigon by helicopter of the last U.S. diplomatic, military and civilian personnel. This was completed in the early morning hours of April 30. Not only did North Vietnam conquer South Vietnam, but the Communists were also victorious in Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh on April 17, as were the Pathet Lao successful in capturing Vientiane on December 2. Like Saigon, U.S. civilian and military personnel were evacuated from Phnom Penh, and the U.S. diplomatic presence in Vientiane was significantly downgraded, and the number of remaining U.S. personnel was severely reduced. Signatories: Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., former United States Ambassador to South Vietnam, led the U.S. delegation. William P. Rogers, United States Secretary of State. T.R.N. Van Lam, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Vietnam. Nguyen Thi Binh, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Nguyen Duy Trinh, Minister for Foreign Affairs for the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Other key figures in the negotiations: Henry Kissinger, La Thc Tho, Thich Nhat Hanh,